I was standing in the kitchen, lost in thought, when the door swung open, and there he was, my stepson, Scott. His eyes froze, and so did I, realizing I was completely exposed. "Mom!" he stammered, his voice cracking. I scrambled to cover myself, but the moment lingered, heavy with tension. Neither of us spoke, but something undeniable passed between us, something that shouldn't have been there. Scott wasn't just my stepson. He was the quiet, reserved type who always kept to himself. When I married his father 5 years ago, I never thought much about the awkward dynamic of blending families. My husband, David, was everything I had hoped for, steady, loving, and dependable. Our home was a sanctuary, a place where we could all just exist without the chaos of the outside world. At least, that's what I thought. Scott was in college now, living at home for a semester while saving money. His presence was a quiet one, the kind you'd almost forget, until moments like this. Moments that shifted something in the air, leaving me unsettled. I always saw him as a polite young man, careful with his words, never disrespectful. He reminded me of David in that way, yet there was something different about Scott. Something intense. Our household was the picture of stability on the surface. David worked long hours, trusting me to keep the home running smoothly. I poured my energy into making our lives comfortable, but there was a part of me, a part one buried deep, that longed for something more. My days often felt repetitive, cleaning, cooking, managing the little details of a life well lived. I told myself it was enough, but then little cracks began to show. It started with the glances, subtle, almost imperceptible. Scott's gaze lingered just a moment too long when we crossed paths. At first, I dismissed it as harmless, but then there was that day in the kitchen. The memory of it burned in my mind like a wildfire, refusing to be extinguished. His expression that day wasn't just shock. It was something else, something that mirrored the feelings I didn't want to acknowledge within myself. I thought about telling David, but what would I even say? That there was tension I couldn't quite put into words? That my stepson's presence suddenly felt like the most complicated thing in my life? It was easier to stay silent, to pretend that nothing had changed. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed, and there was no going back. It began with subtle changes. Scott, once quiet and reserved, started spending more time around the house. He'd linger in the living room after dinner, his presence filling the space in a way that felt almost deliberate. I'd catch him looking at me out of the corner of my eye, his gaze steady, unreadable. It wasn't overtly inappropriate, but it was enough to make my heart race. At first, I convinced myself it was all in my head. I was overanalyzing things, searching for something that wasn't there. But then there were the questions. Scott started asking me about my day, his tone casual but curious. "Are you happy?" he asked me once, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear him. The question caught me off guard, and I laughed it off, brushing it aside. But the way he looked at me after, like he was searching for an answer I wasn't willing to give, left me feeling exposed. David, of course, was oblivious. He worked long hours, often coming home late and exhausted. I told myself that was the reason for the growing distance between us, the reason I felt so lonely even when we were in the same room. I didn't want to admit that I was starting to notice Scott in a way I shouldn't. It was wrong, I knew that. But the more I tried to suppress those thoughts, the stronger they became. The tension between Scott and me was palpable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Every interaction felt charged, even the most mundane ones. When he handed me a plate during dinner, our fingers brushed, and the brief contact sent a jolt through me. I pulled my hand back quickly, my cheeks burning, but Scott didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my stomach twist. Then came the late-night encounters. I'd find him in the kitchen, standing by the fridge with a glass of water in his hand. "Couldn't sleep?" I'd ask, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something like that," he'd reply, his eyes meeting mine in a way that made it hard to breathe. The conversations were innocent enough, but the tension between us was anything but. I started noticing other things, too. Scott's phone was always within reach, but he never seemed to use it around me. When I walked into a room, he'd straighten up, his posture shifting as if he were bracing himself for something. And then there were the moments of silence, those heavy, loaded pauses that stretched between us, filled with things neither of us dared to say. It all came to a head one evening when David announced he'd be working late. The house felt empty without him, the silence almost suffocating. I busied myself with chores, trying to keep my mind off the growing unease that had settled over me. But then Scott appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, avoiding his gaze. "No, I'm fine." He didn't leave. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Are you sure? The air between us felt charged, electric. My heart pounded as I tried to think of something to say, something to break the tension. But no words came. I could feel his eyes on me, could sense the unspoken questions lingering in the space between us. Scott, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. You should go. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine. Then he nodded, his jaw tightening as he turned and walked away. But the weight of that moment stayed with me long after he was gone, a constant reminder of the lines we were dangerously close to crossing. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and guilt. I told myself that nothing had happened, that nothing would happen, but it was getting harder to believe my own lies. The moments with Scott, the glances, the lingering touches, the unspoken words, were starting to consume my thoughts. I'd replay them over and over, analyzing every detail, every nuance, until I felt like I was losing my mind. Scott wasn't making it any easier. He seemed to be everywhere. When I went into the kitchen, he'd appear moments later, casually leaning against the counter like he had every right to be there. If I sat in the living room with a book, he'd find a reason to join me, his presence filling the space like a quiet storm. He never said anything outright, but his eyes spoke volumes. They were steady, searching, and impossible to ignore. One evening, after David had gone to bed early, I found myself in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear Scott come in until he spoke. You're working too hard, he said, his voice soft but insistent. I turned to face him, my pulse quickening. Just trying to keep busy. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. You don't have to do everything alone, you know. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The tension between us was palpable, almost suffocating. I could feel the warmth of his presence, the intensity of his gaze, and it terrified me as much as it thrilled me. Scott, I began, my voice trembling. This isn't right. He didn't move. I know, he said quietly. But that doesn't make it any less real. His honesty was disarming. I felt my resolve crumbling under the weight of his words, his presence, his unwavering gaze. I wanted to tell him to leave, to put an end to this before it went any further. But I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my voice caught in my throat. I'm not trying to make things harder for you, he continued, his tone steady. But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. You don't mean that. I do, he said, his voice firm. And I think you feel it too. His words hit me like a thunderclap. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. The truth was written all over my face, in the way my heart raced whenever he was near, in the way I couldn't stop thinking about him no matter how hard I tried. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, This can't happen. I know, he said. But that doesn't mean it's not already happening. The space between us felt smaller than ever, the air thick with tension. He took a step closer, and I didn't move. His hand brushed against mine, an innocent touch, but it sent a jolt through me like nothing I'd ever felt before. My breath caught in my throat as he leaned in, his face inches from mine. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice low and full of emotion. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was screaming at me to walk away, to put an end to this, but my body refused to listen. Instead, I stood there, frozen in the moment, unable to move or speak. The sound of footsteps upstairs broke the spell. I stepped back quickly, my face burning with shame and guilt. You need to go, I said, my voice shaky but firm. Scott hesitated, his eyes searching mine one last time. Then he nodded, turning and walking away without another word. I watched him leave, my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a physical force. As the door closed behind him, I sank onto a chair, my hands trembling. I had come so close to crossing a line I could never uncross, and the realization left me reeling. I knew I needed to put a stop to this, to set boundaries before it was too late. But a part of me, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, wasn't sure if I could. The days that followed were even harder. Every time I saw Scott, I felt the weight of what had almost happened between us. The tension was still there, stronger than ever, and I could see it in his eyes every time he looked at me. I tried to avoid him, to keep my distance, but it was like trying to outrun a storm. No matter where I went, it followed me, relentless and unyielding. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The moment everything unraveled came on an ordinary evening. David was out of town for work, and the house felt unnaturally quiet. I tried to distract myself, burying my thoughts in meaningless tasks, but the tension that had been building between Scott and me over the past few weeks refused to be ignored. It was as if the silence itself was urging me to confront the storm I'd been running from. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard the soft creak of the stairs. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to focus on the clothes in front of me. "Do you need something?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Scott didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped into the room, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I couldn't sleep," he said finally, his voice low. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Maybe you should try." "I've tried," he said, taking another step closer. "But it's hard to sleep when there's something I can't stop thinking about." I froze, my hands gripping the fabric in front of me. "Scott," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to stop this." "I can't," he admitted, his tone raw. "And I don't think you can either." I stood, the laundry forgotten, and faced him. "This isn't right," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "We can't keep doing this." "But we haven't done anything," he countered, his eyes locked onto mine. "Not yet." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I took a step back. "That's exactly why we need to stop now. Before it's too late." He shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "It already feels like it's too late. Every time I'm near you, it's like I can't think straight. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he closed the distance between us. His hand brushed against mine, tentative but deliberate, and I felt my resolve slipping away. "Scott," I began, but he cut me off. "Just tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "If you can look me in the eye and tell me that, I'll walk away, and I won't bring it up again." I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there was nothing between us, but the words wouldn't come. The truth hung between us, heavy and undeniable, and I hated myself for it. I can't," I admitted finally, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The air around us felt electric, charged with emotions neither of us could contain. He stepped closer, and I didn't move. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the weight of everything we'd been avoiding pressing down on us like a tidal wave. And then it happened. He kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, the floodgates of everything we'd been suppressing bursting open. The kiss deepened, and for a few fleeting moments, nothing else mattered. The weight of my guilt, the fear of discovery, the consequences of what we were doing, all of it faded into the background. But reality came crashing back all too quickly. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment, and I pulled away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "David," I whispered, panic flooding through me. Scott's eyes widened, and he stepped back, his hands trembling. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "You need to go," I said urgently, pushing him toward the hallway. "Now." He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine, but then he nodded and disappeared up the stairs just as the front door opened. I scrambled to collect myself, smoothing my hair and taking a deep breath as David walked in. "Hey," he said cheerfully, setting his briefcase down by the door. "You're still up?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just finishing some laundry." He nodded, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through the house. "I'm going to grab a shower." "Long day." "Okay," I said, my voice tight. As soon as he was gone, I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling. My mind raced, replaying everything that had just happened. I knew I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and the weight of it threatened to crush me. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath it was something even more dangerous, a lingering thrill I couldn't ignore. The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. Scott avoided me, and I avoided him, but the weight of what had happened hung in the air like a storm cloud. Every time our paths crossed, my heart raced, and I knew he felt it too. David, of course, was completely unaware. He kissed me goodbye before heading to work, his trust and affection only making my guilt worse. I watched him drive away, the weight of my secret pressing down on me, and I knew I couldn't keep this up. Something had to give. That evening, as the house settled into its usual routine, I found Scott in the kitchen. He was standing by the counter, his back to me, and I hesitated before stepping into the room. "We need to talk," I said softly. He turned to face me, his expression a mix of guilt and longing. "I know." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "What happened last night? It can't happen again." I know, he said, his voice quiet. But that doesn't change how I feel. Scott, I began, but he interrupted me. I'm not asking for anything, he said, his tone earnest. I need you to know that I care about you. More than I should. His words cut through me, leaving me reeling. I wanted to tell him to stop, to walk away, but I couldn't. The truth was, I cared about him too, more than I was willing to admit. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, and we both froze. David's voice called out from the hallway, and Scott stepped back, putting a safe distance between us. But the look in his eyes told me that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after everything changed, the weight of my choices pressed down on me like a physical force. David was cheerful as usual, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. His casual good morning, honey, made my stomach churn with guilt. I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I poured coffee, each movement feeling like a betrayal of the trust he had in me. Scott avoided me that morning. He grabbed breakfast quickly, mumbling something about a study session before disappearing out the door. The silence he left behind was suffocating. Every clink of the coffee cup, every step I took around the house, echoed with the memory of what had happened the night before. I couldn't get the image of his eyes, filled with longing and conflict, out of my mind. David kissed me goodbye, promising he'd be home late due to a work dinner. His affection felt like a dagger to my heart. As soon as he left, I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. The house was empty, but my thoughts were louder than ever. How had I let it come to this? How had I allowed myself to cross a line that could destroy everything? The hours passed in a haze. I tried to distract myself with chores, but every task only reminded me of the life I'd built with David. A life that now felt like it was hanging by a thread. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Scott. Can we talk? My heart raced as I stared at the screen. I knew I should ignore it, but my fingers moved on their own, typing a response. Not here. Meet me at the park in an hour. The walk to the park was nerve-wracking. My mind raced with what I would say, how I could possibly undo the damage that had already been done. Scott was waiting when I arrived, leaning against a bench, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His expression was serious, but there was a softness in his eyes that made my chest tighten. I'm sorry, he said as soon as I approached. I never meant to put you in this position. I nodded, my throat tight. I'm sorry too. But Scott, this has to stop. We can't keep doing this to ourselves. He looked at me, his jaw tightening. I know. But I can't just turn off how I feel. You have to, I said firmly, though my voice trembled. Whatever this is, it's wrong. It's going to destroy everything. The pain in his eyes was unbearable, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. You have a future ahead of you, I continued. A bright one. Don't let this ruin it. What about you? He asked, his voice cracking. Are you just going to pretend this never happened? I don't have a choice, I said, my chest aching with the weight of the words. I have to. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I don't want to lose you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not losing me, I said gently. We need to find a way to move past this. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the distant chatter of children playing and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The weight of everything unsaid hung between us, heavy and unyielding. When I finally returned home, the house felt like a stranger to me. Each photo on the wall, each piece of furniture, was a reminder of the life I was risking. I couldn't let this continue, no matter how strong the pull between Scott and me was. That evening, as David sat at the dining table, laughing about his day, I felt like I was suffocating. Every smile he gave me, every touch of his hand, was a reminder of what I stood to lose. Scott sat across from us, quiet and withdrawn, his eyes avoiding mine. The tension was unbearable, and I excused myself early, claiming a headache. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She was a stranger, a woman who had betrayed her husband, who had crossed a line she swore she never would. The days that followed were no easier. Every interaction with Scott was fraught with unspoken tension, every glance a reminder of what we were trying to bury. I threw myself into my routines, desperate to create some semblance of normalcy, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with my bare hands. Scott began spending more time away from the house, a silent acknowledgement that we both needed space. But every time he walked through the door, my heart skipped a beat, torn between relief and anxiety. The guilt was relentless, a constant shadow that followed me everywhere. David, oblivious to it all, continued to trust me implicitly. His love, his faith in me, made the guilt unbearable. I knew I had to make a choice, and soon. The line had been crossed, but the fallout was still within my control, if I could find the strength to do what needed to be done. But deep down I knew the truth. No matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, the damage had already been done. And there was no turning back. The days turned into weeks, but the weight of my choices never lifted. Each morning, I woke up with the same crushing guilt, the same overwhelming fear that everything I had built with David would come crumbling down. And yet, part of me felt trapped in an unrelenting cycle of longing and regret. Scott's presence in the house had changed. He kept his distance, retreating to his room or spending more time outside. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was polite, superficial, as if we were strangers sharing a space. But the tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for one wrong move to set everything ablaze. David, ever trusting, never suspected a thing. He carried on as if nothing had changed, his faith in me unwavering. It was both a comfort and a torment. Every smile he gave me, every kiss goodnight, was a reminder of the secret I carried. A secret that was slowly tearing me apart. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something had to give. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds. I had made a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake, but if I didn't confront it, I would lose everything that mattered to me. The next morning, I found Scott in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. His shoulders were slumped, his face shadowed with exhaustion. He looked up when I entered, his eyes searching mine, but I kept my expression neutral. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He nodded, setting his mug down. "I know." We sat at the table, the silence between us heavy. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "Scott, what happened between us? It was wrong. I think we both know that." He didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the table. "I know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't change how I feel." "It has to," I said firmly. "We've both made mistakes, but we can't let those mistakes define us. You have your whole life ahead of you, and I have a marriage that I need to protect." He looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "Do you love him?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. "Yes," I said, the word coming out stronger than I expected. "I love David, and I can't hurt him like this." Scott nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I get it," he said, though his voice was thick with emotion. I don't know how to forget." "You don't have to forget," I said gently. "But you do have to move on. We both do." The conversation ended there, and though it didn't feel like closure, it was a step toward something resembling resolution. Over the next few weeks, Scott began to withdraw even more, spending less time at home and more time out with friends. The distance was painful, but it was necessary. It was the only way we could begin to heal. As for me, I threw myself into my marriage, determined to rebuild what I had almost destroyed. I started paying more attention to David, showing him the love and appreciation he deserved. It wasn't easy. Every moment with him was tinged with guilt, but I knew it was the only way forward. Looking back, I realize how close I came to losing everything. One moment of weakness, one bad decision, could have destroyed not only my marriage but also the lives of the people I cared about most. It's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. A reminder of the importance of boundaries, of the danger of letting emotions overrule logic. Scott and I never spoke about what happened again. He moved out a few months later, transferring to a university in another state. The distance was a blessing, giving us both the space we needed to move on. I heard from him occasionally, updates about school, a new job, a new girlfriend, but the conversations were brief, polite, and devoid of any mention of the past. As for David, he never found out. And while part of me felt relief, another part of me felt the weight of that secret every day. It's a burden I'll carry forever, a constant reminder of the mistakes I made and the lessons I learned. In the end, life went on. The scars of that time remained, but they served as a reminder of how close I came to losing everything, and of the strength it took to pull myself back from the edge. If you've ever been caught in a moment where the lines between right and wrong blurred, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of relationships. Stay tuned. The next tale will leave you speechless.